My name is Roman Kleiner, and I'm a Vice President of Engineering at Egnyte, which is a leading vendor in the content collaboration and data security and governance space. And within that, I'm leading distributed teams that provide the infrastructure and DevOps capabilities for all of Egnyte solutions.
So, Roman, thanks for being on the show. The topic we're talking about today is promoting internally versus hiring externally. I know before when we talked, you had some thoughts on that. And I think the one question that I want to start off with you is at the top level, when you're looking at the company and you're trying to make that internal decision, whether you are actually promoting or going externally, when and how do you decide that, hey, you know what, we actually do need to go external? What are some of the factors that potentially would cause you to go external versus looking internal?
Yeah. So I start with a bit of what you would call a requirements list, like a job spec. I'm trying to abstract myself from whether it's internal or external. First think, what do I need? Like if I were to build a sports team. And then I'm doing either mentally or explicitly something that's called like a succession plan or a hiring plan for that role. And you might say, internally I have person A and B, and they can be there in a year or 2 years, and this is how they need to be built up for there. Maybe they are even available immediately. And then based on that, I decide, do I have enough of a runway to go and get that person to that level, or do I need to go to externally now? And of course, the urgency behind filling in that role on the roster plays a big role as well.
I guess when you mention urgency, maybe dive in and tell us what that actually means in terms of the urgency that the team might be feeling.
Yeah, I think this is probably best answered through examples. For example, I have a team that's in an unhealthy situation. Attrition is abound. The technology they're responsible for is not doing that well. And I quickly need a technical leader or a manager to go and execute a turnaround right there and then. So the urgency in that situation is high because we might be talking business continuity. Or vice versa. I see that there is some kind of business domain that's expanding. And today I'm okay with how it runs, but I suspect that in 6-12 months, looking at my crystal ball, this will need a wholly different scale with adoption coming in, and I would need a higher order architect who dealt with that scale before. So the urgency is less there, but the need is still acute. And there are all kinds of other examples on that scale that I can bring.
Absolutely. When you're looking at the notion of bringing somebody outside in to manage, right? Obviously, you have a team, you're deciding to go external versus internal. When you make that decision, what are some of the potential negative impacts to the current team?
Yeah, I mean, to state the obvious, when you go externally, you do send a signal internally saying, hey, you guys are not cutting it, to put it bluntly, to fill that in. Maybe I could sugarcoat it, but at the end of the day, that's what people would read into that. And I think you need to mitigate it by just being transparent. What I would dislike doing is just doing some kind of clandestine search for a role, and then presto, there is some kind of check in the box popping up with a person appearing, and now everyone needs to deal with that. You need to be transparent. Say, I'm looking for this role, and these are the qualities that I'm doing. And ideally, in a very ideal world, everyone would take an honest look at themselves and say, yeah, I'm not that person. Practically, of course, it's rarely the case, but at least you start by really being open about whom you are looking for and why.
Absolutely. I guess, just thinking about what you said, if I'm on your team and you bring somebody in from the outside, I might be looking at that going, well, where does that lead me? When can I become a manager? Obviously, I'm sure you're thinking and worrying about that if you do bring somebody in from the outside. How do you help the team understand, hey, for you to be a manager, this is the gap, this is what we need to work with if somebody's actually approaching you, so they can understand, why they weren't potentially selected?
Yep. Now we, I think, go into the whole domain of career development and career planning of sorts with people. And in many cases, it starts with just learning the aspirations of people, but also making sure they and I have a a common understanding of what they can do today and what they could be doing tomorrow. And again, it's much easier said than done, because there's always in real life, you would find some kind of divergence, but in most cases, you won't be completely off. And then coming back to that transparency from my previous answer, or maybe I'll even go all the way back to that example of a team that's in turmoil and needs fixing. And I might say, sure, Amir, you want to be a manager. And let me talk about that team. We had this attrition, we have this instability. What do you think would take to solve that? And could somebody who has never been a manager solve that? And, of course, you might, depending on your level of confidence, you might answer differently, but it puts something that somebody can relate to immediately and understand what kind of challenges they would need or kind of capabilities they need to build up in themselves.
There. I guess we're talking about the standpoint of the impact on the team, right? I think a couple of the questions we've talked about is around that. I guess if you were to think about the person coming from the outside in, you're bringing an outside manager. Again, the team's aware that there's a gap, whatever that gap could be. That person coming in, they have some work to do. They have to overcome some maybe hard feelings, some of the exact opposite things that we've been talking about when you do bring somebody in. How do you help that person assimilate? How do you make sure that person will transition comfortably into the role, or as comfortably as they can?
It's not a question that has a very simple answer, because it would vary a lot depending on the role. And in many ways, it's also to do with my management style, even if I promoted somebody, because apologies if I'm going a bit in a roundabout way, but even if I promoted from within, I suddenly have completely different expectation for a person who is already there. So I need to help them too, because now I'll come to them with a very different set of demands. But coming back to the essence of what you asked, first things first, I want that person to draw their own impressions, because if I come in and I'm telling them, hey, this chap has these problems and that one has this potential, I'm already, I think, diluting the picture a bit. B, and that's more upon me, I want to really be certain that they will be adding value, not just come in as another layer of management, not come in to kind of go and fill in some kind of gap in the org chart, but they have something genuine to bring in, not just for me, but something that the rest of the team will recognize. And I want to know that during the interview process itself, because at that point, I don't need to do much once they've joined. I just let them do what they already have been doing before in their career, or what they're promised to be doing. And C, I think, and that's going to sound very standard, but be crisp and clear about your 3-6 month expectation with them, so that they will not be second guessing what I'm asking to do.
Absolutely. I guess maybe this is a different question, but out of curiosity, when you're looking at, you're a manager, you're a boss, and you have to go externally, obviously there's a gap on the team. Does that affect you? Is that an implication, or was there some is there some issue with career development, some issue with hiring, aptitude? Obviously, if it's urgency, that's a different scenario. But if you have to bring a manager from the outside, does that mean that potentially there was something missed? So that obviously everyone loves to promote internally, right? That's everyone's goal. But what about for the manager? I guess in your case, we're going to have to use specific details about you, but just generally speaking, what does that reflect on, let's say, the VP of engineering in terms of their boss having to go outside of the ranks to bring somebody in?
Well, it doesn't always mean that there was some kind of gap in internal development. And I'll bring a bunch of examples. Your org might have just grown, and you never needed anyone at VP level for a while, and you didn't even expect to need one before too long. And suddenly you do. You've grown by a factor of 5 or 4 or whatever, and this need appeared. And second, another valid reason, and that comes from personal experience, is that you have an org that's been really originating from engineering excellence. You've hired to build people who love building stuff. And at a certain level, those roles become less about building. They become more about the risk and liaising, strategizing, whatever you will. But that's just not stuff that people even may perhaps want to do. You suddenly need to bring somebody like that in. And all of that happened to me on both sides of the fence in my career. But then, yeah, sometimes it might mean that you could have, in the presence of a time machine or a crystal ball, go 2 years ago, 1 year back, and say, "Oh, that this might happen in 2022, 23. Let me now go and work with somebody to bring them there." But hindsight is always 2020. So basically, a long answer saying that that's perfectly valid, and I never had any negative thoughts or any like misgivings about somebody who had to go outside in situations like that, because none of us are perfect.
I think that's very fair. Yeah, I think obviously it's hard to forward predict success or career development, or like you mentioned, company growth, a pandemic, and having to manage differently. All those things, who could predict those? But when you're looking, I guess to kind of focus back on your internal team, when you are looking to evaluate the internal team and you're looking at the skill sets you need, how far of a gap? It might be based on urgency, I don't know, but how far of a gap are you willing to go? You know what, this person is not far off. They can stretch to the role, versus, it's just something that I can't potentially take a risk on now. Is that come up?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a bit of an art, but I'll reveal my personal bias. My bias is that if I see that there is a decent chance for somebody to tick all of the boxes in 6-12 months, or even most of the boxes, I'll rather make a mistake that way, because it sends a good message to the org as well. It says, yeah, you can build your career here. Again, it doesn't need to come all the way back and say, let's try and make everyone happy and always promote from within. But if you see and you compare, and it would go there, because at the end of the day, they do come with a very healthy baggage. They come with institutional knowledge. They come with all kinds of things that for an external hire, even a talented one, will take 1-2 months to build. So, but that again depends. Sometimes you just have some core basic thing that you want that role to fulfill. And let's say, to use a basketball analogy, I need like a center there to dominate the forecourt. I cannot ask the rest of my team to grow 7 inches. You do need a tall guy for that. So if you don't have it, then you don't have it. You cannot build it. And take now a closer example. If suddenly I want my team to be cross-geographical and I want somebody to manage across different sites, you cannot just go and ask somebody, can you do it tomorrow? You need somebody who's done it, ideally, especially if you are in a very sensitive early state of doing that. So, and then you have all kinds of examples between those two.
Absolutely. Institutional knowledge, you brought up an interesting point, and I'm going to ask you a question about that. When you consider institutional knowledge, information that potentially is not documented, this person you mentioned might be close, but they have some of that. When you do bring somebody in from outside, and I mean, a lot of companies might have this gap, but the question is institutional knowledge and ramping up that external hire. What have you seen that's helped somebody succeed with absorbing as much as they can, so they're not relying on watching more or less?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I would say it really varies on the role and its seniority. Because if I brought it in, let's say, an architect, then the answer is really standard. They need to get hands-on really quickly. They need to get tickets to work on. They need to get something that they are accountable to deliver even within their first month. And then it is just learning to swim by throwing into the water kind of environment. If you bring a director or a VP, it's a different deal. But I would say for me, it begins even at the interview level. Like, understand culturally, will they even want to do that? And how will they approach? And were they technical before they came in? Will they be a cultural fit? Because again, at that point, they'll know what to do. Of course, I'll help them, I'll establish the context, but they'll know what to do, how to quickly acquire that knowledge. It's maybe somewhat of a generic answer, but it's hard to go and kind of cover the gamut of all of the different roles using one measure.
Sure. If you're going to dive deep into that, if you're going to look at an external person coming in a management position, and to absorb institutional knowledge to minimize the impact on culture, what have you seen work?
First, make sure that person is a cultural fit and it's been really put in clear words. For example, if they are coming into an organization where managers are expected to review code and comment on code and take architectural decision, you say that during the interview process, at the end of it, and after. And when you come and say you specify your success criteria, you say, you're expected to know technically more than I do about your domain within X days. I mean, maybe I'm like putting that too much in a black or white, but at least that's the idea. They need to know. They hopefully, again, that comes to hiring, but technology the team is working on is not nice to have. They need to have some background from their engineering career in that technology. And typically, that team would have some good roadmap or some technical debt to tackle. So you might say, here's again, part of your 30, 60 days is to go and deliver on that. And I find it hard to imagine that they'll do that by complete delegation if coming into a culture of that team. So it will start coming in through the day-to-day. But maybe if I may add something that I'll add from my own personal experience, something I really like doing and I love when others do it. When they join a team and they want to acquire that institutional knowledge, often they will come and say, documentation is not there or it's outdated. 90% of the groups are like that. Say, okay, here's a great chance for you to apply the Boy Scout rule and write it yourself. And if you write it yourself, you know for a fact that you understood it after you talked with everyone else and you improve your own team.
I like that. That's a good answer. You mentioned between culture fit. You also hear about being culturally additive. When it comes to somebody moving into a management position, and let's say it is an external hire, you have to obviously have I think to your point, a certain level of culture fit. How much culture add do you want? It's going to be art, not science. I know that, but just from your standpoint, how much of their background, their toolbox, how much of that do you want to be additive to your culture?
Again, it depends. So I'll answer it firstly through example, but please feel free to kind of go and twist me in a given direction. But let's say I'm in a company that has grown and now I want more culture of process. Maybe not all the way, but I don't want to operate again by just whatever it takes approach, but I want to install some process and I want that person to bring that in. So in that case, of course, I will look for people who've done stuff like that before, but not completely take them from a different end of the pole. For example, let's say I don't want to kind of give a particular name, but let's say take them from an old school vendor and parachute them into a startup that just moved from the C to D stage or whatever. So, and I want to tell them, hey, one of your goals, 60, 90 days is solve this problem. Maybe I had too many outages because people are just doing unorganized changes, or maybe I saw the repeated outages happen because people didn't learn enough. So can you fix that for me? And hopefully they will use that particular problem to add some cultural element, be it about more rigor, be it about more sense of you ship it, you own it, responsibility, whatever I needed. But I'd rather not be explicit, tell them, hey, this is how I want culture to be. It needs to come through solving particular challenges.
I like that. That's a great answer. I guess just to piggyback off of that, obviously you just mentioned you want a certain amount of culture add where it's the right opportunity. You obviously have the team who's also assimilating to the manager, and you don't want any. Obviously we have to go through that storming, norming, conforming process. When you see that culture add coming, and you as the that person's manager, how do you help them, or do you let them deal with the storming, norming phase? Do you try to step in? I know it's probably case by case, but just generally, what have you seen in your career?
Again, a good question, which is I'm taking my second to consider, but I'll So first, I do want to show the team that I care. It's not like, I installed a new manager and I just release my hands from the wheel and say, now you go. So I typically would do some skip one-to-ones, and I'll let the manager know I'm doing it. So skip one-to-ones a little bit, how they feel, what they observe, because it's important. We are talking here about a whole team. It's not just moving an individual contributor somewhere at the mid-level. So how they feel about that, what works, what doesn't work. I'll usually ask the manager for their assessment of the team as well. And those two would probably together paint a picture. Again, it varies, but some managers, it didn't happen to me a lot or at all, but some managers really come with their evolution in mind and say, let's change everything. And and to be honest, if that was required, I probably wouldn't have done it myself without waiting somebody to come in, or at least told it explicitly. But in that case, of course, you need to rein in a little bit and say, okay, you know what? Yeah, sure, I agree with you. All of this needs solving, but people have the decent, like a finite budget for how much they tolerate change, and the fact that you're in is already a change for them. So let's try and play within that budget. So it's a bit of a balancing act. But most of the time, again, if you've done your hiring well, if you've done your goals well, it's rare that kind of that storming will be truly a big storm. It will be more of known problems that somebody solves in a cultural add the way to steal a word from you from a previous question.
Absolutely. I love your views on the subject. It's art. That's why I like covering similar topics. You get different point of views. So thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing. I definitely appreciate your time. I like to wrap up with two questions. One is, if you could ask a future guest on this show to cover a topic, what would you like to listen to?
I'm very interested in hearing more how people seamlessly support the switch into a manager. We talked about that a lot. We talked about promotions, but I think that switch of somebody from, let's say, a technical leader into a manager happens left and right in our industry. But many times people still do their previous role rather than the new one. So how do you do that? How do you do that in a clean manner? Always fascinates me.
Awesome. That's a great question, actually. I think that's one of the ones I like. I don't think I've yet found the perfect answer. We'll keep asking it. And I think that's a great topic to have somebody come on to specifically talk about. Secondly, if somebody does want to reach out to you, Roman, to talk about anything you mentioned on the podcast, or just reach out to you because of something you mentioned, what's a good way of getting a hold of you?
Very easy. I'm on LinkedIn, Roman Kleiner. I think there's one of me, I hope. And I respond to anyone who wants to chat with me about such exciting topics.